For years, Melanie had believed she'd finally found peace. After the chaos of hospital rooms, broken marriages, and the long, sleepless nights that came with raising a medically complex child, the sleepy suburb of Heather Ridge had seemed like a miracle. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from behind rose-trimmed hedges, where the air smelled of grilled food on Saturdays, and the biggest controversy was a missing lawn gnome. For Melanie, a hardworking single mom juggling a remote IT job and her daughter's needs, it felt like a second chance. Her daughter, Sophie, was 8, though most strangers guessed younger. She had been born with a rare neurological disorder that left her nonverbal and prone to sudden seizures. Her world was shaped more by textures and tones than words. Bright lights sent her into distress. Loud sounds could trigger panic, but in her quiet, unspoken way, she loved deeply. Melanie often said that Sophie spoke through her eyes, and when she smiled, it could undo the weight of the whole world. Their life was far from easy, but it was theirs, and it was full of small victories. A new word formed through sign language, a week without seizures, a calm grocery trip, wins that most wouldn't notice, but Melanie celebrated each one. Then came Karen Bellington. The HOA had announced her with little fanfare, just a bold font email stating a leadership transition and a note that she'd bring positive energy and stricter community standards. From the moment she stepped into power, Heather Ridge began to change. Gone were the laid-back neighborhood barbecues and open lawn gatherings. In their place came new restrictions, silent surveillance, and a growing list of fines. Karen didn't just enforce the rules, she invented them. And she enforced them with the cold precision of a bureaucrat obsessed with control. Melanie first met Karen during a routine walk with Sophie. It was a warm spring afternoon. Sophie had been having a good day, humming softly as they strolled under the canopy of blooming dogwoods. Then, without warning, Sophie's gait faltered. Her arm stiffened. Melanie recognized the signs instantly, a sensory overload building toward a meltdown. She gently knelt, speaking in calm, rhythmic tones, trying to soothe her daughter back to center. That's when Karen stormed out of her yard in a crisp white blouse and perfectly ironed khakis, phone in hand, scowl locked in place. "What is that noise?" she snapped, pointing towards Sophie, whose breathing was becoming erratic. "Is she screaming? Because that is not acceptable here." Melanie froze, stunned. "She's not screaming. She's having a medical episode." "Please, she's disrupting the peace," Karen said flatly, already dialing a number. "This is a quiet neighborhood. There are rules." Melanie's heart pounded. She gathered Sophie into her arms, shielding her as best she could, while her daughter whimpered and rocked. Karen didn't flinch. If anything, she looked disgusted. She needs to be indoors if she's going to behave like that, or somewhere else entirely. That night, Melanie wrote it off as a one-off encounter with an ignorant woman. But she underestimated how deep Karen's obsession with order went, and how far she'd go to keep her version of perfect unchallenged. Over the following weeks, Melanie received letters from the HOA accusing her of excessive noise violations and non-compliant yard signage, which turned out to be Sophie's medical alert sign. The final straw was a warning about disturbing visual displays after Melanie installed blackout curtains to help Sophie with light sensitivity. Every attempt Melanie made to explain or plead for understanding was met with the same cold, dismissive response. "We must maintain the community's standards." Still, she tried to ignore it all. Sophie was her priority. As long as her daughter was safe, the rest didn't matter. But safety is a fragile thing. It happened on a humid summer night, one of those nights where the air feels too thick to breathe. Melanie was washing dishes while Sophie played quietly on the living room floor with her sensory toys. Suddenly, Melanie heard a sharp, high-pitched gasp. She dropped the plate. Sophie was convulsing, her small body trembling, eyes rolling back. Melanie was on the floor within seconds, cradling her. She reached for the emergency medication kit, administered the dose with trembling hands, and dialed 911. She gave the dispatcher their address, her voice cracking but clear. "Please, hurry. She's not breathing right." She ran outside to flag down the ambulance, barefoot, panic choking her chest. The flashing red lights appeared at the end of the block, relief washing over her, until she saw it. Karen's silver SUV. It was parked directly across the narrow street, engine off, hazard lights blinking, angled so carelessly that the ambulance couldn't pass. The paramedics honked once. Nothing. Again. No movement. Melanie screamed. She sprinted toward the SUV, banging on the driver's window. Karen sat inside, sipping tea from a travel mug. "Move the car." Melanie shouted, frantic, "My daughter's dying." Karen calmly rolled down the window 2 inches and said, without emotion, "Her crying woke up my dogs. You don't get to make this street your emergency lane just because you failed as a mother." Melanie's knees almost buckled. She turned and waved desperately at the paramedics, who began unloading the stretcher and equipment from a distance. Every second mattered, and every second was stolen by the woman sitting in that SUV, sipping tea like it was any other Thursday evening. As the paramedics sprinted past Karen's car and into Melanie's home, Melanie stood frozen, unable to comprehend the cruelty she had just witnessed. Sophie's life had been jeopardized not by fate, but by a neighbor with a clipboard and a God complex. And in that moment, something inside Melanie snapped, not with fear, but with fire. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she swore to herself Karen Bellington would regret ever stepping into their lives. The doctors said it was close, too close. If the ambulance had arrived just a minute later, Sophie could have gone into full respiratory arrest. Melanie stood in the ICU hallway, staring blankly at the whiteboard where nurses updated patients' vitals in dry erase marker. Sophie lay inside, still sedated, an oxygen tube resting under her nose, heart monitor beeping rhythmically like a metronome of pain and fear. Her fragile chest rose and fell, and Melanie watched each breath like it might be the last. She kept replaying it in her head. Karen's face behind that SUV window. Calm, cold, dismissive. Her crying isn't my emergency. The words echoed louder than any siren. Melanie wasn't just shaken. She was changed. Something inside her had cracked open, and the raw truth beneath it wasn't just rage, it was purpose. When Sophie was stabilized and resting, Melanie stepped out to the waiting area and called the HOA emergency line. No answer. She sent an email to the board with a full account of what had happened. She even included the paramedics' report and a nurse's written statement about the delay's danger. She expected urgency, apologies, maybe even outrage. But the next day, when she returned home with Sophie, weak but recovering, there was a letter taped to her door. Notice of noncompliance. Excessive noise, complaint date of violation. Last night, 8:31 p.m., filed by HOA President Karen Bellington details. Disruptive noise during late evening hours in violation of HOA guidelines. Melanie's hands trembled as she read it. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just another attack, this time weaponizing the very emergency that nearly killed her child. The neighbor stayed silent. Most hadn't seen what happened. The ambulance had come and gone quickly. Karen, meanwhile, was already spinning her version. Melanie overheard her on a walk the next morning, talking to another neighbor. "She's unstable," Karen said. "The child? I don't mean to sound heartless, but the noises at night, it's a problem. She should be in a facility." That word, facility, made Melanie's stomach churn. A few days later, the fines began to pile up. One for a garden hose left coiled in a non-approved area, one for having a medical box on the porch, Sophie's emergency oxygen tank storage, one for having tinted windows that didn't match neighborhood aesthetics. But it was the last one that knocked the breath out of Melanie's lungs. Unauthorized signage on lawn. Violation. Medical alert sign indicating seizure risk penalty, $200 fine, and demand for immediate removal. Melanie stood staring at it, fists clenched. The sign was the only warning responders might have if she wasn't home. It was for Sophie's safety. But Karen didn't see it that way. Karen saw it as an eyesore, a blemish on her picture-perfect vision of suburban life. Melanie filed a formal complaint with the county. She called the non-emergency police line. She posted online, tagging HOA watchdog groups and special needs advocacy boards. The replies came in waves: sympathy, outrage, support, but no one with real power stepped in. It was like screaming into a void. A week passed. Sophie began recovering slowly, but the weight on Melanie's chest never lifted. She slept with one eye open, worried not just about her daughter's seizures, but about what Karen would do next. One night, as Melanie wheeled Sophie's portable oxygen into the living room, she noticed something off. The alert sign was gone. Just gone. Pulled from the yard. She checked her doorbell cam, and her breath caught in her throat. At 3:42 a.m., a figure had crept onto her lawn with a flashlight and gloves. Tall, hooded, slow and methodical. They removed the sign and walked off into the darkness. Melanie called the police. They came, took a report, and left. No follow-up. No action. Just another file in the system. The following morning, another violation notice arrived, this one citing non-compliance with sign removal order. Karen had anticipated her resistance, and she was punishing it. Melanie's breaking point came the day she received the notice of intent to fine for medical equipment storage, claiming Sophie's oxygen machine, stored in a shaded, locked crate on their porch, violated neighborhood visuals. She stood frozen at the mailbox, fingers clenching the paper, heart thudding wildly in her chest. She looked around and saw Karen across the street, sipping her tea again, the same smug smile on her lips. Karen raised her cup in a mock salute. That was the moment Melanie stopped playing defense. That night, she went online and began researching ADA regulations, disability protections, civil rights laws, and court case precedents. She stayed up until 3 a.m., highlighting everything that proved what she already knew. This wasn't just cruelty. This was illegal. She opened a new document on her laptop and began drafting a formal legal complaint. As she typed, the pain in her heart began to burn less like despair and more like fuel. The morning after Melanie began drafting her complaint, she found a business card tucked under her doormat. Tomas Delgado, U.S. Army retired security and surveillance consultant. On the back, in neat handwriting, it read, "Saw what she did. You're not alone." Tomas lived 3 houses down, an older man with a limp, a quiet demeanor, and an American flag flying proudly from his porch. Melanie had barely spoken to him before, but something about his timing felt like fate. She invited him over that afternoon, and over coffee, he told her everything. "I've lived in this community 15 years, Tomas said, eyes narrowing. "Karen's not just a control freak. She's dangerous. She bullied a widowed neighbor into moving out over an unauthorized porch chair. She made a teenage boy take down his wheelchair ramp because it was visually unappealing. I've seen this before. She targets the vulnerable. She pushes until you break." Melanie's throat tightened. Why didn't anyone stop her? Tomas shrugged grimly. Most people are scared, or too tired to fight. And the board? Half of them are in her pocket. Her brother is treasurer. Her cousin processes architectural reviews. She's built herself a little kingdom. Melanie felt rage coil inside her like a spring, but this time, she wasn't alone. Tomas offered his help. He had old surveillance cameras, ones that didn't just show grainy doorbell clips, but captured high-definition footage, wide-angle views, and night vision. They set them up discreetly around Melanie's property. One faced the sidewalk. Another watched the side gate. A third covered the front porch. "Don't worry," Tomas said with a faint smile. "She has no idea who she's messing with." For the first time in weeks, Melanie felt something other than fear. But Karen wasn't done. 2 nights later, a heavy thud shook Melanie from her sleep. She rushed outside and found Sophie's medical storage crate smashed open. The oxygen tank was still inside, but the lid had been wrenched off, its latch twisted like someone had kicked it with steel-toe boots. She checked the camera. There he was, Jeff Bellington, Karen's husband, tall, balding, in gym shorts and a hoodie. He'd come around the side yard just after 2 a.m., glanced up, and pried open the crate before disappearing into the night. Melanie sat frozen in front of the screen, trembling, not from fear this time, but from fury. She downloaded the footage and forwarded it to the police. The response? A bland voicemail 2 days later. Unfortunately, unless the equipment was stolen or damaged beyond repair, there's no actionable crime here. It's a civil matter. Maybe consider fencing your yard. Fencing. Against her own neighbors. Melanie took the footage to the HOA board next. She attended the next open meeting, holding a tablet in her hand, ready to confront them with evidence. But before she could speak, Karen leaned into the microphone and said, "Mrs. Porter, before you waste everyone's time, I should inform you that the board has received several complaints about harassment from your property. We've opened a review into whether your cameras violate HOA privacy regulations." The room went silent. Melanie's jaw dropped. "You're serious?" Karen's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. "Quite." That night, Melanie broke down for the first time. Not in front of Sophie, never in front of her, but alone in the bathroom, muffling her sobs into a towel. How could this be happening? How could someone so cruel keep winning? But her breakdown didn't last long. The next morning, she logged into a private Facebook group called HOA Horror Stories, where she had previously posted about her experience. This time, she included the surveillance footage of Jeff. Within hours, the video had gone viral, shared over 3,000 times, with hundreds of comments flooding in. And then came a message request from someone named Jillian. "Hi, Melanie. I used to live in Heather Ridge. Karen bullied me out 5 years ago. I still have emails. I'm so sorry you're going through this. If you need help, I'm here." And another. "My son has autism. Karen fined us for his trampoline. I left the neighborhood. Still have the paperwork." And another. "She blocked our wheelchair-accessible van from parking in front of our house. We moved a month later. Happy to talk." Melanie was stunned. It wasn't just her. It had never been just her. Karen had left behind a trail of quiet victims, mothers, veterans, elderly residents, disabled children, all driven out by rules weaponized against them. With Tomas's help, she compiled every testimony, every email, every recorded fine. And then she reached out to a local civil rights attorney. Her name was Leah Foster. Sharp, young, fearless. And after reviewing the evidence, she didn't hesitate. "We're suing the HOA. And we're suing Karen personally." Melanie exhaled for the first time in what felt like forever. This time, there would be no more silence, no more hiding. But Karen wasn't done escalating, not even close. The next day, 2 uniformed officers knocked on Melanie's door. Child Protective Services had received an anonymous tip that Sophie was being neglected in a hazardous environment. Melanie nearly collapsed on the spot. Sophie clung to her leg as the social worker stepped inside, clipboard in hand. It was the cruelest blow yet, and it made one thing chillingly clear. Karen wasn't just trying to push Melanie out. She was trying to destroy her. Melanie sat on the living room floor long after the CPS worker had left. Her hands were still shaking. Sophie sat quietly beside her, clutching her weighted blanket, unaware of how close their lives had just come to unraveling completely. The caseworker had found no issues. The home was spotless, medical equipment in order, documentation up to date. But that didn't matter to Melanie. What mattered was that Karen had crossed another line, a dangerous, vicious one. It was no longer just harassment. It was war. The very next morning, Leah Foster, Melanie's new attorney, arrived with a leather portfolio and a mission. "We're not just going to stop this," she said, her tone razor sharp. "We're going to expose every violation, every misuse of power, and everyone who enabled her." Leah wasted no time. She filed a cease and desist letter against Karen and the HOA for harassment, citing violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, civil rights law, and local municipal codes. She also filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. But legal action alone wouldn't be enough. Karen knew how to manipulate systems and hide behind the HOA's rules. So Melanie and Tomas took it further. They created a private message thread titled Karen Survivors and invited every former resident who had reached out. Within 2 days, over 20 people joined. Each brought their story and receipts, photos of notices, videos of confrontations, audio recordings of Karen's threats, and emails from HOA members dismissing complaints. One woman had even saved voicemails from Karen calling her disabled husband a drain on the neighborhood's property value. The stories were horrifying but powerful. Tomas worked tirelessly, turning every document and recording into an organized evidence packet. Leah reviewed it all, and with every passing day, her confidence grew. This isn't just a case, she said. It's a pattern, a predatory, coordinated abuse of power. We're filing a class action suit. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't slowing down. After her CPS stunt failed, she doubled her efforts. Melanie's mailbox was flooded daily with more petty violations. Excessive window tint, unauthorized porch decor, improper plant height. She even sent a citation for unapproved wheelchair ramp materials, even though Sophie didn't use a wheelchair. But something had changed. Melanie wasn't breaking down anymore. She was documenting. Every fine was scanned, every conversation recorded, every glance from Karen captured, and every piece of it was now evidence. Then, one Thursday morning, while walking Sophie to the mailbox, Melanie noticed a car parked at the end of the street. A man inside was pointing a long-lens camera toward her house. When she approached, he sped off. Tomas later confirmed what they suspected. Karen had hired a private investigator. But it backfired. Melanie's cameras caught everything, including the man trespassing on her property later that night to peek through her kitchen window. And that's when the final blow began to form. Tomas had been keeping track of the HOA's financial filings, those publicly accessible annual budget reports. With his military background and security clearance experience, he spotted something immediately. The numbers didn't add up. The HOA had been collecting increased fees over the past 3 years, but spending had barely changed. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for. When he cross-checked with board decisions, he found the kicker. Karen had approved landscaping contracts with a company called Belco Property Management, owned by her nephew. It was textbook corruption, self-dealing, fraud. Leah's eyes lit up when she saw the documents. This is the hammer. They filed a formal motion for court-supervised discovery into HOA finances. Within 24 hours, a subpoena was issued. Karen was served that Saturday afternoon in front of neighbors as she watered her manicured hydrangeas. That weekend, Leah arranged a meeting with a local journalist from a prominent investigative news site. They handed over the footage, the testimonies, the contracts, the falsified fines. The reporter promised a full exposé. Melanie barely slept that night. But something was different in the air now. Hope. Neighbors who had avoided her for weeks now approached her with quiet nods and whispered support. "We're with you," one said. "We just didn't know how bad it was." Then came a moment Melanie would never forget. Karen walked past her driveway one morning, slower than usual. No smug wave, no clipboard, just a hard stare and a bitter scowl. She said nothing. For once, she had nothing to say. But the silence spoke volumes. She could feel it. Karen was losing control. But Melanie wasn't celebrating yet. She knew how dangerous people became when power slipped from their hands. And sure enough, it wasn't long before Karen made one last desperate move, one that would shock the entire neighborhood and push the case from civil conflict to criminal territory. It was a quiet Monday morning when it happened. Melanie stepped outside to find something waiting in her yard. Not a violation notice, not a threat, but shattered glass and red spray paint on her garage door. For words, chilling and final, "You shouldn't have fought." Tomas reviewed the camera footage, eyes cold. "It's time," he said. "We take this public, all of it." By sunrise, the footage of Karen's final warning was already backed up in 3 places. Tomas had isolated the segment where a hooded figure, too tall and wide to be Karen herself, hurried across Melanie's lawn at 3:12 a.m., holding a can of red spray paint. Though the figure wore gloves and moved fast, one brief glimpse of the profile under the porch light was all they needed. It was Jeff Bellington. That same morning, Melanie filed a formal police report, not for harassment, but for vandalism and intimidation. Leah added it as an emergency addendum to their growing lawsuit. Then she made a call to her contact at the local investigative news outlet, the Tribune Eye, who had been preparing a feature story for over a week. The time had come to strike back, and this time the whole world would see it. By Tuesday evening, the story was live. HOA president accused of blocking ambulance targeting disabled child in pattern of abuse. Whistleblowers' hidden footage and new lawsuit allege systemic discrimination by Heather Ridge, HOA leader. The article exploded. Within hours, the story hit trending tags across social media. The doorbell footage of Karen blocking the ambulance was shared on Twitter over 200,000 times. Comments ranged from shock and disgust to calls for criminal charges. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Sophie and hashtag HOA Karen exposed flooded timelines. And then came the coverage from morning shows, disability rights organizations, and even national journalists. But the real blow came the next day when the state attorney general's office announced they were reviewing the case. HUD formally acknowledged the federal complaint and opened an investigation into the HOA's treatment of disabled residents. This wasn't just a community scandal anymore. It was a legal firestorm. The pressure on Karen mounted by the hour. Leah filed for an emergency injunction to prevent Karen and the HOA board from issuing any further citations or contacting Melanie and her daughter in any form. The motion was granted within a day. Karen's reach, at least temporarily, was cut off. Then came court. The class action lawsuit moved forward at warp speed. Leah stood tall before the judge, armed with months of evidence: harassment patterns, financial fraud, ADA violations, and eyewitness accounts. Karen's defense tried to dismiss the case as a misunderstanding. Their lawyer, a smug corporate type named Ruben Glass, tried to paint Melanie as a hostile neighbor and overly sensitive mother. But Leah tore him apart. She presented footage: Karen shouting at Sophie, blocking the ambulance, Jeff vandalizing property. She called Tomas to the stand, who testified in calm, measured detail about the surveillance, the trespassing, the cover-ups. Then came Jillian, the former resident who'd been fined for leaving her cancer medication cooler on her porch. And then a veteran in a wheelchair. And then a single dad with a son who used a speech device. Every story was a nail in the coffin. The turning point came when Leah unveiled the financial records. Payments to Belco Property Management, all funneled under emergency landscaping upgrades, signed off by Karen and rubber-stamped by her cousin. Tens of thousands of dollars had been moved quietly month after month. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the judge looked stunned. Karen, seated at the defendant's table, stared ahead like a statue. Her once pristine blouse was wrinkled. Her hands fidgeted, and for the first time, she looked small. When Leah finished, the judge ordered an immediate audit of the HOA's financials and gave a stern warning. This court sees strong indicators of criminal conduct, including fraud, harassment, and ADA violations. This will not be brushed under any rug. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Protesters, journalists, supporters. When Melanie stepped outside the courthouse with Sophie by her side, the applause was thunderous. But Karen's unraveling wasn't done yet. 2 days later, county officials arrived at the HOA office with subpoenas and search warrants. They seized boxes of documents, laptops, and external hard drives. Karen was escorted from the building. Her brother, the treasurer, was detained for questioning. That night, the police confirmed it. Karen Bellington and Jeff Bellington were both under criminal investigation. Charges being considered included obstruction of emergency services, conspiracy to harass, and financial misconduct. The very next morning, Karen was arrested at her home. It was poetic. The same neighbor who once wielded power like a weapon now stood handcuffed on her own porch, her perfectly trimmed roses behind her, wilted and ignored. The same neighbors she once bullied watched from their windows, not in fear, but with relief. Melanie didn't cheer. She didn't gloat. Instead, she knelt beside Sophie, who, even without words, had always understood the energy around her and whispered, "You're safe now, baby." Mommy kept her promise. The lawsuit moved toward final resolution. A judge ordered the HOA dissolved, and placed the community under temporary municipal oversight. Fines were refunded, violations reversed. Melanie and the other plaintiffs were awarded damages, and the neighborhood council voted to rename the HOA building, which would now house a disability outreach center. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Melanie received an invitation to speak at a state conference on disability rights and housing equality. She stood at the podium months later, telling her story to a room full of advocates and lawmakers. Her closing words echoed like a quiet roar. We weren't asking for special treatment. We were asking to be left alone, to live. But when someone targets your child, your family, your peace, you fight back. And if they make you feel invisible, you show them what it means to be seen. Life after Karen didn't return to normal. It became something new, something stronger. Peaceful, yes, but not passive. For the first time since Sophie was born, Melanie didn't feel like she was surviving. She was living. With the HOA dissolved and the community under interim city governance, residents began stepping out of their homes not with suspicion, but with renewed warmth. The suffocating air of fear had lifted. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now brought over casseroles, toy donations, and heartfelt apologies. Some cried. Others just hugged Melanie in silence. Sophie blossomed, freed from the tension that had weighed on every corner of their home. She began sleeping through the night again. Her seizures, though still part of their lives, became less frequent. The oxygen crate remained on the porch, unchallenged and untouched. The replacement medical alert sign, now laminated and lined with gold trim, was proudly displayed on the lawn. This time, no one dared take it down. One morning, Tomas knocked on Melanie's door with a surprise. He had pooled donations from neighbors and friends and presented Sophie with something she had always longed for, though she never had the words to ask. A specially trained therapy dog, a gentle golden retriever named Sunny, with eyes as soft as a lullaby. From the moment Sunny entered the house, Sophie's world expanded. She smiled more, laughed more, began engaging in her own ways, pointing, giggling, even humming to the dog when she thought no one was watching. And one evening, as Melanie tucked her into bed, Sophie reached out, took her mother's face in her hands, and said, clear and soft, "Mom." It was the first word she had ever spoken. Melanie's knees buckled as she sobbed into her daughter's arms, overwhelmed with joy. It was a sound she would replay in her heart for the rest of her life. Not because it was a milestone, but because it was a miracle, a victory not just for Sophie, but for everything they had endured to get here. The legal cases continued in the background, slowly but steadily. Karen and Jeff both pled guilty to obstruction and conspiracy, each receiving probation, fines, and mandatory community service. Karen was banned from holding any community leadership role for life. Civil suits from other victims followed, one by one. Leah handled each case like a general at war, composed, brilliant, and relentless. As for the neighborhood, it chose to heal with action. A new community committee was formed, not an HOA, but a residents' council, open and transparent. It had no power to fine or harass, only to serve and support. One of its first projects was to create an inclusive playground at the local park designed with sensory-safe zones, wheelchair accessibility, and quiet spaces for children like Sophie. Melanie was invited to help design it. Standing under the shade of tall elms with the sounds of children playing, she watched Sophie gently place Sunny's paw onto a sensory tile that changed color with heat. Around them, no one stared. No one whispered. Everyone smiled. The playground was dedicated in Sophie's name, Sophie's place, where all kids belong. But perhaps the most unexpected shift came from within Melanie herself. What had begun as fear transformed into fierce advocacy. She partnered with Leah and several disability rights groups to create workshops for parents dealing with hostile HOAs. She spoke at town halls. She became a voice for the silenced, the exhausted, the families too worn down to fight. Her story had once gone viral. Now, her voice became a lighthouse for others. One day, she received a letter in the mail from someone she didn't recognize, an older woman named Margaret who lived 2 states over. The letter read, "Dear Melanie, I saw your story and cried. I've been fighting my HOA for years to allow my husband's medical ramp. They called it an eyesore. I was ready to give up until I saw you speak. You gave me the courage to keep going. Thank you. You reminded me that we matter. Melanie folded the letter gently and placed it in a small keepsake box, right next to Sophie's first signed drawing, a faded hospital bracelet, and a photo of Sonny with his tongue out and tail mid-wag. It was over, but it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A few months later, Melanie stood on a quiet stage in a large auditorium. It was a state conference on inclusive housing and neighborhood justice. Lawmakers, attorneys, activists, and families had all come to listen. Melanie's voice, once timid and afraid, rang clear and steady across the hall. I never wanted to be a warrior. I wanted to be a mother. But when someone threatens your child, you don't stay quiet. You rise. You learn every law, call every office, write every word until someone finally listens. Not because you love the fight, because you love your child more than fear. I was told to be quiet, told I was too emotional, told to just move, but this is our home. And my daughter deserves to grow up in a world where her needs aren't treated like a burden, where her laughter is music, not a nuisance. We're not asking to change your world. We're asking you to make room in it. And now we're done asking. As she stepped off the stage, applause erupted. Not just polite claps, but a standing ovation. Melanie walked back to the front row, where Sophie waited, sitting proudly beside Sonny, her little hands patting his head, eyes shining. That night, as they walked home under the stars, Melanie looked up and whispered into the night, "We were invisible once. Now they see us." And that was all she ever wanted. It wasn't the kind of victory with parades or confetti. But for Melanie, it was the kind of peace that felt like a full breath after years of drowning. Weeks after the courtroom verdict that toppled the corrupt HOA, something shifted in the neighborhood. It wasn't just quiet, it was safe. For the first time since she moved into Pinebrook Ridge, Melanie didn't check over her shoulder every time Sophie's oxygen machine whirred. She didn't worry about fines, threats, or someone knocking to complain about her child's very existence. She finally felt seen. Then, on a chilly Saturday morning, Melanie opened her front door and froze. Sitting on the porch was a small box wrapped in soft yellow paper and tied with a green ribbon. A handwritten note rested on top for Sophie, from the neighbors who finally learned how to listen. Inside the box was a thick folder full of signatures and donation slips. Dozens of families had come together to purchase something she never dared to ask for, a specially trained medical service dog for Sophie. 3 weeks later, a golden retriever named Milo padded through their front door, wearing a little red vest and wagging his tail like he'd been waiting his whole life to meet them. Sophie lit up in a way Melanie had never seen. She reached for him immediately, clumsily but deliberately. Milo gently placed his head in her lap, letting her pet him, her tiny fingers brushing through his soft fur. It was the calmest Melanie had ever seen her daughter. Milo wasn't just a companion, he was trained to detect seizures, fetch medicine, and apply calming pressure during meltdowns. But beyond all that, he became Sophie's first real friend. Someone who didn't care about her limitations, just her laughter. The neighborhood continued to change. Gone were the passive-aggressive newsletters, the endless violation notices, and the sneering glances. In their place, town picnics, sidewalk chalk drawings from neighborhood kids in front of Sophie's house, and volunteers helping repair the damage Karen and her cronies had left behind. The HOA had been officially dissolved. In its place, a community council had been established, an open, diverse, nonprofit group that focused on support rather than control. It had no power to fine, only to serve. Melanie had been offered a seat on the council, but chose to nominate Tomas instead. He accepted with humility and fire. Tomas became a quiet local hero. He was the one who'd secretly documented Karen's misdeeds, turned over the HOA's hidden financial books, and testified on behalf of not just Melanie, but every homeowner who'd been bullied into silence. People baked him pies, mowed his lawn, left thank you notes taped to his car. He never sought attention, but he'd earned respect. One evening, as Melanie tucked Sophie into bed, She heard a quiet knock at the door. A man she barely recognized stood on the porch, holding his hat in his hands. His voice cracked as he introduced himself, Brian, the former HOA treasurer. He handed Melanie an envelope. Inside was a typed apology, simple and sincere. I let fear and pride blind me. I should have stood up to Karen. I'm sorry I didn't protect your daughter when I could have. If there's anything I can ever do to make things right, please let me. Over the next few days, Melanie received 4 more letters. Former board members, former neighbors, even a retired HOA president from another community who'd seen the story online. One letter read, "You showed me what real strength looks like. I'm stepping down from my position. It's time new voices lead, with compassion, not control." Melanie placed every letter in a box beside Sophie's favorite books. They weren't trophies, but reminders that even when it felt like the world didn't care, her voice had mattered. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment that followed a few weeks later. It was a quiet afternoon. The sun filtered through the curtains as Sophie sat on the floor, Milo curled beside her. Melanie was folding laundry nearby when she heard a sound she hadn't expected. "Emma, Mom," she froze. Sophie looked up, eyes wide but calm, and repeated it again. "Mom." For a moment, Melanie thought her heart had stopped. She dropped the laundry, fell to her knees, and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she rocked Sophie gently, whispering, "I'm here. I'm right here." It was the first word her daughter had ever said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was everything. Later that night, Melanie sat on the porch with Milo resting at her feet. She watched the stars above and let the silence settle. Not the silence of fear, but the kind that follows a storm and leaves room for healing. She thought about everything they had been through. The pain, the betrayal, the moments she almost gave up. But then she looked back through the window and saw Sophie, sleeping peacefully, a small smile on her face, Milo curled protectively beside her. Melanie took a deep breath, then whispered the words that had been sitting in her heart for so long. "We were invisible to them, but now they'll never forget us." And with that, the final chapter closed, not with bitterness, but with quiet, unstoppable power. The kind of power born from a mother's love, the kind of power that changes everything. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because at HOA Denied Access, we shine a light on the injustice others try to bury. Your voice, your story, your power, it all starts here. Loudspeaker comment below. Have you ever faced HOA abuse or seen someone stand up against it? We want to hear your story. You are not alone.